Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome back to Parsha Insights. This is our special Lag BaOmer edition of Parsha Insights, where we're going to be looking at some of the traditions associated with Lag BaOmer and the story behind Lag BaOmer. We touched on this a little bit last week, and we did that in the context of the Parsha, which actually talked about the Omer. And today we're going to look at Lag BaOmer, at this holiday, this particular day, which is a unique day in the Jewish calendar because it's a more, I would say, a more day of modern interpretations. These are later contributions to the Jewish calendar. The idea that a day like this would be part of our observances, our rituals, and it's also not clear what we're celebrating today. I think if you would kind of survey Lag BaOmer is a day of bonfires. Why is it a day of bonfires? Something to do with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Okay, fantastic. So we'll take a look a little bit at what that has to do and what the unique significance of this day is, and I think see some very interesting traditions while we're at it. So we're going to jump right in to we're going to start with Jewish law. We're going to start with the Shulchan Aruch in section Orach Chaim, number 493.1. So these are within the context of laws that are applicable during the days of the Omer. It says no hagim. This word is a loaded word. No hagim. Where does it come from?
To drive.
Linhog. Good. No hagim. In modern Hebrew, we drive. And in rabbinic Hebrew, it would be associated with the word minhag. And I'm sure there's a linguistic connection that we can draw between minhag and no hagim. I'm sure creatively we could connect the idea of a custom and a car, but I'll leave that for us to do for homework. But how to connect those concepts? No hagim. We have a custom. It is customary. So again, he's not fixing a straight law, but saying it's customary. Shaloli sa'isha ben pesach la'atzeret, not to get married between Passover and Atzeret, which is a way that the Torah refers to Shavuot, in these 49 days basically, but not all 49. Ad Lag BaOmer, until the 33rd day of the Omer, mipnei sheba'oto zman metu talmidei Rabbi Akiva, because until that moment the students of Rabbi Akiva perished. Until that moment they died for the first 33. That was the plague we spoke about last week, and until that day they died. Aval ares l'kadesh shapir dami, but to get betrothed, to get engaged, to have those type of ceremonies, and keep in mind that in ancient times, an engagement was not just a pledge. An engagement had halachic validity. When a person, we do actually what's called engagement is that moment that we do under the chuppah, where the ring is presented and the groom says, Harei at mikudeshet li betaba'at zo, you are betrothed to me with this ring. That actually is the engagement. And that was, in ancient times, that was done separately from the marriage. And it had, when I say it has halachic validity, what do we mean? It means that to break an engagement in Jewish law requires a get.
Divorce. Yeah.
It would require a divorce, not just to break a marriage, but to break an engagement would require a get. Now, in our practices and the way we do it, what we call an engagement is not an engagement. An engagement ring without a chuppah, without anything, is not an engagement. It's a promise to get engaged under the chuppah. So we do that. That's an aside. And so he says in Shulchan Aruch, and just to note, the Shulchan Aruch was written by Rav Yosef Karo. Rav Yosef Karo lived in the late 15th, or mostly in the 16th century, and that is the code of Jewish law. And so he's presenting us with a unique period, which is, it's not prohibited to have celebrations during this period. Just getting married is the part that's prohibited, but not even, because he says, Misha kafas v'chanas, but if a person couldn't hold back and he just had to get married before Lag BaOmer, just had no choice, just couldn't hold back, einon shimoto, there's no punishment. It's done. It's not a clear out prohibition. This is not eating on Yom Kippur. This is not, this is not illicit relationships. This is not any of the above. This is just a custom not to get married until Yom Kippur, until Lag BaOmer, I'm sorry. And then in these small letters you see here, these small letters. So I don't know if we've spoken about this before, about the Shulchan Aruch and who the Shulchan Aruch was and how the Shulchan Aruch was written. But basically, the Shulchan Aruch was written by Rav Yosef Karo, who spent much of his scholarly life and died in the city of Tzfat in northern Israel. He died in the year 1575. And he wrote basically mostly based on what we would now call Sephardi sources. That's how he compiled his Jewish sources. After him, a little bit later, comes Rav Moshe Isserles. Rav Moshe Isserles offers kind of the Ashkenazi approach and writes something that we call the Mapah. The Mapah in Hebrew means the tablecloth. If the Shulchan Aruch, which is this part, is called the Shulchan Aruch, the set table, so along comes the Ashkenazi and writes something that we call the tablecloth, which was something to put on the set table, which was basically addendums and addition and edits that he had to make it reconcile with what would be more familiar with Ashkenazi halacha. One interesting piece of Jewish trivia is we know that Rav Yosef Karo came first, and then Rav Moshe Isserles came after him. Who died first? Rav Moshe Isserles died first, because Rav Moshe Isserles only lived until 42 years old, and Rav Yosef Karo lived until 87 years old. So Rav Yosef Karo was born in 1488. The Ramah was born some 40-something years later in 1530. So he was his junior colleague, writing, kind of being deferential towards Rav Yosef Karo. But ultimately, the Ramah passed away in 1572, and Rav Yosef Karo passed away 3 years later. So Haggah, he writes. So after all that, the Ramah, the Ashkenazi commentator, offers the following. He says, Mihu, however, milag ba'omer va'elach hakol shari. From Lag BaOmer and onwards, everything is permitted. Everything is permitted. Not everything. We're talking about getting married, a Jewish marriage. Not everything's permitted, but a Jewish marriage is going to be permitted within the context of the days of the Omer. Okay, so that's presenting what the Omer is, how this applies to contemporary halacha, how this reconciles with Montreal customs. There are unique Montreal customs that even the Ashkenazi community did not get married after Lag BaOmer until the beginning of the month of Sivan. There are different ways in which they calibrated that, but we'll leave that for now. The main idea is that today is a day of a celebration. Why? The Shulchan Aruch says, because Rabbi Akiva's students stopped dying on this day.
Plague stopped.
The plague ended on this day. Therefore, when the plague ends, we party. That's Lag BaOmer.
Rabbi
Yes.
Share, does that come from Yashar?
I don't know. It's a I don't know the etymology of Yashar. Share in Aramaic comes from the word which means to loosen.
Okay.
So permitted would be the same concept.
Gotcha.
It would mean to loosen a belt or to loosen a garment would be the same word. But share, I don't know if Yashar comes from that. We'd have to look at earlier Semitic languages to give a definitive interpretation of that. Along comes the Pri Chadash. The Pri Chadash living in 17th century in Tuscany. A fascinating guy who was born in Tuscany, moved to Israel, did most of his scholarship in Israel, and then returned to Egypt, interestingly, to do fundraising for his yeshiva back in Israel. It was back in the 17th century. And when he gets to Egypt, he discovers that his own work is being disparaged, that the work that he wrote called the Pri Chadash. Now, when you write a work called the Pri Chadash, what does that mean? Pri is fruit, and Chadash is new. You write a work called the new fruit, fresh fruit. What does that imply about everything that came before you? What is that saying?
Something deleterious.
Fresh fruit as opposed. So the sages in Egypt were taking offense at his approach and saying he was being disparaging to the previous generations. And there actually was a ban of his books that went on in Egypt by the rabbinate of Cairo for, I don't know for how long, for at least a century. That went on until it was reversed. So there's just some interesting trivia about the next work, about the Pri Chadash. And he says,
a long time.
What's that?
They held grudges a long time.
They sure did. They didn't have the same new age mechanisms that we have to get over our psychological inhibitions and what holds us back and everything. They didn't process as well as we do, I guess. But yes, they hold grudges. So the Pri Chadash says, Umasha kasav umar bebo ktsat simcha. So he's writing about what exactly is happening on Lag BaOmer. He says, Umihu yesh ledakdek besimcha zo lama. So let's look at this. Why are we happy? Why is Lag BaOmer a day of happiness? If it's because they stop dying, mabakach. So what? No one was left. Everyone was dead. At the end of a plague, the day the plague ends, you think they're going out in the streets and partying? No, it's a day of intense mourning, of taking stock of what's happening. What is this celebration? I think it's a good point. He said, "Umad tiva shel simcha zo." What's the nature of this celebration? Ve'efshar, it's possible, he says, she'asimcha hi ha'otzot tamidim shehosif achar kach Rabbi Akiva. It's the simcha is on the students that he added afterwards. And I'm going to remind us of what we saw last week, that there was a plague, and then there was a group of students that were added afterwards that Rabbi Akiva was able to continue his teaching after his original students had perished. Shalom etu ka'ela. It's on the celebration that they didn't die and that there were still students around. So that's the nature of the celebration. It's a double. What the Pri Chadash is offering us is that it's, there's an additional reason. It's not just that the plague stopped, but it's also that there were other students. And who are the other students? And so look at this section that we looked at. The world was desolate of Torah until Rabbi Akiva came to the rabbis in the south, and I still don't know why it says the south, and taught Torah to them. And this second group was Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua. They're the ones who upheld the Torah. And the one who gets the most attention here, at least in terms of this day, is Rabbi Shimon. You know his last name?
Bar Yochai.
Bar Yochai. Yochaison.
Right.
Yochayevich. That's it.
It's amazing that Akiva didn't pass away with his students.
It is amazing. It is amazing. That's part of the tragedy as well, is that he saw all of them die, but he himself did not, but he was able to rebuild in an extraordinary way. Okay. So we're going to look at Rabbi Shimon, because there's a part of the tradition is that today was the day. It's called the Yom Hilula. It's called, we'll look at what that means, but it's his birthday, it's his death day. It's a day that's the word Hilula, it comes from the Hebrew word Hallel, celebration. It's in Aramaic, right? The Hallel being the celebratory prayer, it's Aramaic. Hilula will also come to mean a wedding. So just look at this brief passage in the Zohar. It's not so brief, but the passage in the Zohar, which talks about the day of his death, of Rabbi Shimon's death. So this is talking about Lag BaOmer. Rabbi Shimon spent the entire day, his last day of life, in a prophetic stream of consciousness, revealing the deepest mystical secrets of Torah. He told his students, until now, I have held the secrets close to my heart. Before I die, I wish to reveal all. So Lag BaOmer, this is what we're celebrating a lot. It's not just Rabbi Shimon. It's that this is the day that the secrets of Jewish mysticism were revealed, were passed on from Rabbi Shimon to his students. Rabbi Abba, who was a student assigned with the job of transcribing his words, he said, I couldn't even lift my head due to the intense light emanating from Rabbi Shimon. The entire day, the house was filled with fire, and nobody could get close due to the wall of fire and light. And that's going to be a theme of Lag BaOmer. Fire and light. Fire. Intensity. At the end, one teaching, by the way, that I don't know, I'm looking around if people were at services. I heard the Devar Torah at services this morning, but one teaching we shared today was, I see Michael was there, and the teaching we shared, just Michael, you'll apologize. I don't like repeating myself in general. Sometimes it's unavoidable. There was a rabbi who told me before I started. I think it was before I started here. He said, rabbis inevitably you have to repeat yourself. You only have so much material. He said, so here's the rule. A joke, you can repeat once a year. A story, you can repeat twice a year. A Devar Torah, you can repeat every week. So here we go. So the Devar Torah that we said this morning was very simply that today is the 33rd day of the Omer. It's associated with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and associated with the concept of light. The 33rd word of the Torah is in the verse that says, and God saw the light that was good. It was good. And the 33rd word of the Torah is the word good, associated with light. The Hebrew word tov is the 33rd word of Genesis. Tov, the numerical value of the word tov, is 17. From Lag BaOmer until Shavuot remains 17 days. So that's part of the teaching, associating Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai with light. At the end of the day, the fire subsided. I was able finally to look at the face of Rabbi Shimon. He was dead, wrapped in his tallis, lying on his right side and smiling. So what do you make of this image of Rabbi Shimon at the end, on this last day of his life? What do you make of it? Fire, his face, light emanating.
Mystical.
Does it remind you of anything?
Fire emanating from the head of Moshe and when he goes to Har Sinai.
Beautiful. That's exactly the description of Rabbi Shimon, is the description of Moses when he comes down from the mountain. The people can't look at him because there's light emanating from his forehead. Can't even look at him. And Rabbi Shimon as well. As long as he was living, as long as this light was there on this last day, that's how holy. I mean, that's what the Zohar is telling. You want to know how holy Rabbi Shimon was on this day? You want to know what this experience was? It was like what? It was like Mount Sinai. And Rabbi Shimon was like Moshe, because there was light coming off of his head. You couldn't even look at him. That's how intense the teaching was. And the fire and the light, right? All this is meant to bring us back to the experience, to the revelation at Mount Sinai. And we continue. Rabbi Shimon sat and expounded. Rabbi Abba sat before him and wrote, and his son, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, repeated the matters. All the disciples listened and were moving. So they're writing, repeating to make sure that they get it, make sure that they remember it. They know that this is sacred. The fire rose in flames around them. The sun didn't set. Right? When does the sun not set? Right? That's Joshua again.
Joshua.
We are reliving all the biblical miracles in this one moment of Rabbi Shimon's death. He revealed secrets of the Torah from the furnace of the hidden secrets until he came to the verse, for there God commanded the blessing, eternal life. And Rabbi Abba said, our holy teacher did not finish saying the word life before his words grew weak. I, who was writing, I wanted to write more, but I couldn't hear. And then I didn't lift my head because the light was so intense. I wasn't able to look when I heard the heavenly voice call out, saying, they will add length of days and years of life and peace for you. I was shaken. I heard another voice. He asked life of you. You gave it to him, a length of days forever and ever. The entire day, the house was enveloped in fire. No one drew close to it. It was surrounded by fire and light. So that's a picture of the last day of Rabbi Shimon. We're going to look at the moments after his death and then at one other nuance, and that's going to be it for today. But any thoughts on this last day? Are you seeing anything else in this description? Yeah,
before I even think about that, I'm the Zohar. So I'm reading the Zohar quite a bit from your pages, and it seems that we're getting it from the source, because if I remember correctly, that's the original Kabbalah that's been built from this Zohar. And there was one rabbi, I'm reading the book from Ira Robinson, who's writing about the Rabbi Mordechai Richler's uncle, who tried translating from Aramaic the whole into Hebrew, and somehow it wasn't too successful commercially. And he was a rabbi, but he just couldn't make a living with his 14 children. But very learned. So I'm impressed that we're going straight to the Zohar.
Yeah, it's not a place I often go, the Zohar. The Zohar, again, attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but the first instances of the academics, scholars have looked at this intensely, and it's highly debatable and very unlikely that the Zohar goes anywhere near Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's time, and probably happens more than a millennium, is written more than a millennium after Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. But the Zohar is reflecting earlier truths, and there are concepts in the Zohar that you'll find in the Talmud, which is 5, 6, 7 centuries before the Zohar ever made an appearance, probably in the 13th century, 13th, 14th centuries, when the Zohar first makes an appearance in its unique form of being attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his students. When I was growing up in my childhood synagogue, the rabbi, somebody wanted to sponsor a set of the Zohar in English for the synagogue library, and the rabbi refused the donation and said, if you need a translation of the Zohar, you shouldn't be learning the Zohar.
Right.
Zohar is not meant to be studied in English translation.
You have to be a certain age, and you have to be,
on a certain level. So if you can't read it in the original Aramaic, save it for another point in your life. Save it for somebody else. This is not for us.
Yeah, because it's very deep.
It's very deep, and by reading through, we are understanding less than 1% of 1% of what the Zohar is really trying to teach us. But even with that taste will suffice. One more brief section from the Zohar, which is right after his passing, and it says atu trikin. So these trikin, I don't know what trikin are. It's an unusual word. The way they translate it are truculent stingers, which I think I know less about what truculent stingers are than I know about the Aramaic trikin. I'm not quite sure what truculent stingers. I know what shield-bearing warriors are. So I'm going to just fast forward for a moment. I found in a work a little footnote which said, truculent stingers, it's a euphemism. Mighty Torah scholars from Sepphoris in the Galilee who wanted Rabbi Shimon buried in their city, which was famed for his learning. So after he dies, there are shield-bearing warriors and truculent stingers from Sepphoris, meaning the scholars of Sepphoris, the mighty ones. Truculent stingers. I don't know if anybody has ever used that phrase before, or if now it will enter your lexicon, but here you go. You saw it here first. So these scholars came. It's a euphemism for scholars from Sepphoris, and they came and they wanted Rabbi Shimon buried with him. And then the people of Meron, Bnei Moronya, Tzavchim B'Ktirin, they got together and they shouted, they thought that maybe he's not going to be buried there. That maybe because the people are coming from Tzipori, from Sepphoris, they're coming from the other northern area, and they want Rabbi Shimon in their cities, in their places. The people of Meron, where Rabbi Shimon lived, they said, wait, he's not going to be buried here? This is where he was. After the bed emerged from the house, it rose up in the air, fire blazed before it, and then they heard a voice, come and enter, assemble for the wedding celebration of Rabbi Shimon. That's another euphemism. The Hilula, the celebration. After his life, we are celebrating. We are rejoicing in his Torah. He is now being reunited with his source. He is now being brought to the heavens. This is a moment of celebration for Rabbi Shimon. Come, assemble for the wedding, assemble for his yahrzeit. And it goes on. He was buried in the town of Meron. I don't want to get stuck certainly on the current events. Meron last year was the site of a great tragedy, and I don't know if they have rectified.
Yes, it's beautiful today. It was we saw it on television and the Israel channel, and it's beautifully done. All the families were there, happy, orderly. Okay, it was orderly, good.
Hopefully it's safe.
Yeah. As long as they learned from it, as long as it was safe. So that was the death, as described, the death of Rabbi Shimon. We're going to look at in a moment at one of the customs and we'll close with that, one of the customs of Lag BaOmer. So the Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud.
Chet v'keshet, that's what I know.
That's it. Chet v'keshet. Good, the bow and arrow. So it says, Haroeh keshet be'anan, someone who sees a rainbow. Omer Baruch Atah Hashem Zocher Habrit, says a blessing. Blessed are you, God, who remembers the covenant. Rabbi Chia b'shem Rabbi Yochanan says, no, actually the blessing is Ne'eman bevrito v'zocher habrit, that God is faithful in his covenant and remembers the covenant. We do a little bit of a mixture of all of these. We actually add, the way we say the blessing is we say Zocher habrit, that God remembers the covenant, v'ne'eman bevrito, and is faithful in his covenant, v'kayam b'mamaro, and he fulfills his promise. That's the way we say the blessing. A little bit of a longer blessing than is suggested here, but that's based on the Talmud Bavli. This is the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Talmud Yerushalmi's rendition. Rabbi Chizkiah b'shem Rabbi Yirmiyah, so Rabbi Chizkiah says in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, Kol yamav shel Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai lo nirata hakeshet ba'anan. For the entire life of the great Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who we've been discussing, there not one rainbow appeared for his entire life. What does that mean? A rainbow didn't appear. So what?
So they're going to die.
What do you mean they're going to die?
If there's no-
לא זוכרים את הברית.
They didn't remember the covenant. What's the connection with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? What is this saying about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai?
I think the concept was that as long as he lived, he was the guarantor of the covenant. They didn't
Perfect.
need a keshet in the sky.
Perfect. If we understand that the rainbow was put there after the flood as God's way of reminding God's self not to destroy the world again, then you only need a rainbow when there's a reason to destroy the world. And when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was alive, a rainbow wasn't needed. Thank you, Jeffrey. Beautiful. Rabbi Chizkiah, and then we go on, and it says, we'll move to the English for a moment. Rabbi Chizkiah, in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, says, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai used to say, valley, valley, get filled with gold dinars, and it got filled. Amazing. He had these magical words, and he could just fill a valley with golden coins. And part of this has to do, and the part of the backstory of this has to do with the story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the cave, which we're not studying today. That's often studied on Lag BaOmer, but basically he went into a cave for a number of years and stayed there with his son and didn't come out. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai had a particular approach to work and to engage. He was all Torah study all the time. And so the question is, how did he make any money if he's all Torah study? The sages back then didn't, weren't like that, and they didn't have to they had to work. They couldn't only study Torah. And so here's your answer. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai used to say abracadabra. He used to say valley, valley. By the way, we're speaking about Aramaic. I just let slip.
Yeah.
The Aramaic language, the most famous phrase in the Aramaic language is
Bika,
exactly
bika.
what I just said, abracadabra.
Bika, bika. Okay.
Yeah, abracadabra means, ivra means it shall be created, kadabra, as I say. Ivra kadabra, it shall be created as I say, is abracadabra. Okay, there you go. There's your Aramaic trivia for this Thursday afternoon. So Rabbi Chizkiah, in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, also says the following. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai used to say, I saw the people of the future world, and they are few, the really special people. If there are three, then I and my son are of them. If there are two, they are me and my son. Rabbi Chizkiah, in the name of, so you've got more, he clearly knows where he stands, I suppose. Rabbi Chizkiah, in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, said, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai used to say, Abraham should bring near from his back to my back, meaning from his generation to my generation. That's who Abraham worries about. I shall bring near from my back to the end of all generations. What I say is going to attract the people who live now and for all generations to come. Otherwise, Achia, the Shiloni, the prophet Achia, should join me, and I shall bring everybody near. So let's just leave that at this. But the real reason I wanted to show this was the concept of the rainbow that was seen all the days that wasn't seen in Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's life, which gives birth to I quoted this twice, which gives birth to another custom quoted by the Bnei Yisachar, who was a Hasidic commentary, and he was one of the very, very important late 18th, early 19th century commentators. He's with Tzvi Elimelech Shapira of Dinov, was the Bnei Yissaschar. And he writes the following, that one particular custom is unique. Children go to the parks and fields to play with bows and arrows. And the reason, what's the reason for this particular? So one very well-known explanation has to do with the fact that during Rabbi Shimon's lifetime, no rainbow ever appeared in the sky. This is profoundly significant because Genesis relates the rainbow represents God's covenant never to destroy the world degenerate to its status prior to the flood. But as long as Rabbi Shimon was alive, his merit and piety alone were enough to ensure that God would not regret his creation with no need for the rainbow. On the day of Rabbi Shimon's passing, the world was in need of the rainbow. Thus, each year on that day, we recall this man's greatness by playing with the bow. I remember being mystified when I was in Israel for my years studying in Israel. One year, I went to Meron for the celebration of Lag BaOmer. And again, not aware of what danger could exist in crowds like that. It was very crowded. I certainly remember that part. I remember the families who were out there. We went out, it's late at night, it's 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. Children are running around and playing. I remember thinking, how are the parents ever going to find their children in the darkness? They all seem to have found them at some point, but the kids were running around with bows and arrows, with like toy plastic bow and arrows, shooting each other with bows and arrows. And I remember a kid shooting me in the back with a bow and arrow. And I wondering, what is this all about? And I had absolutely no concept that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was associated with a bow. And again, we don't know how these customs develop exactly, but looking back on them, we could say that, the bow represents the rainbow. Did somebody actually sit down at some point and say people should take up bows and arrows? I don't know how that developed, whether that was a top-down or a bottom-up evolution in Jewish law, but in some way connecting the concept of bow to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. But what's unique to me, or what I learned in preparing this, was that Pri Chadash, was the commentary of the Pri Chadash, who said the celebration of Lag BaOmer, if you're going to say it's because the students died or stopped dying on that day, that's not a reason to celebrate. That's a reason to exhale. That's a reason to take stock. But to suddenly be able to get haircuts as people do on Lag BaOmer, to suddenly be able to listen to music, to suddenly be able to get married on that. So you need to find something worth celebrating. What's worth celebrating? The future, the success. That Rabbi Akiva had a student whose name was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. You know what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai did? He learned, he taught, he achieved, and on the very last day of his life, he revealed the hidden to his students. The hidden that our tradition teaches is associated with the Zohar, with Kabbalah, with mysticism, and so much more than the people, Lag BaOmer is the day of the birth of Jewish mysticism, or the dissemination of Jewish mysticism. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai died on this day, but much more importantly, he told the secrets on this day. He revealed the hidden to his students, who in turn have taught it to the generations. And that's why we have access to this today, is because of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, what he did on the 33rd day of the Omer, in terms of sharing that light with his students and with the world. So that was what I had hoped to share today, was a little bit of the laws of Lag BaOmer, the reason behind the laws, and some of the stories behind Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and the last day of his life, which in our tradition is the 33rd day of the month of Omer. Next week, we are going to get back to the Parsha, and we're going to get back to Midrashim, and we're going to have a great time doing it. But until then, just wanted to spend some time on the Omer, on Lag BaOmer. And any questions or comments before we close? Esther.
Yes, I'm thinking back to the rainbow and the fire, and at that point I thought to myself, the 33rd day represents to me optimism. It's the end of the negative part of it, the death and the bad things, and we're off to a new start. So it's now uphill to the next part of the journey.
Yeah.
That's what it represented to me.
Yeah, that's great. I want to add also that the Omer period has changed, and it's certainly changed for me in that, as a yeshiva student, of course, I wouldn't shave during the Omer, and you get to Lag BaOmer and you're scruffy, and my abilities to grow hair have also evolved or devolved over the years, and so Lag BaOmer was also that day where you got your first haircut after Pesach. You get a haircut the day before the Seder, and then you would get a haircut again on Lag BaOmer, and that would be 34 days basically from haircut to haircut, which was often longer than one would go otherwise, sometimes not, but often longer. And then comes an understanding of Yom HaAtzmaut. And then comes an understanding of the days of celebration for Israel. And suddenly there's a day there in which you're saying, wait a second, why am I not getting a haircut or shaving? If that's a sign of mourning, but I'm saying Hallel, it's Yom HaAtzmaut. And so I added to my own personal observance that I would get a haircut and I would shave for Yom HaAtzmaut. Shaving is a separate topic for another time, but certainly get a haircut on Yom HaAtzmaut as well, which made Lag BaOmer a little bit less dramatic in that sense that you were waiting for 34 days to get a haircut. Suddenly you had something, on the 18th day or the 19th day of the Omer where you could get a haircut as well because of Yom HaAtzmaut. So that's just the Jewish calendar is constantly evolving, hopefully in good ways, adding these days of celebration, but that's also a way in which Lag BaOmer has changed, or the focus on Lag BaOmer has changed because of these other days in the Omer, Yom HaAtzmaut, Yom HaZikaron, Yom Yerushalayim. The Omer has become a much more robust period of Jewish observance than it was a few generations ago.
But there's some groups of Jews that won't say Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut.
Yes.
Those kind of divisive amongst us.
Yeah, it's one of the, I would say, many things that Jews do not agree upon. Yes.
My family is going to Meron today. One of the ways that they're preventing the incident from last year is they're giving each family just a certain time limit. They're not allowed to stay over. They're each assigned a certain time in which they can visit Meron. And that's sort of one of the ways of preventing a reoccurrence.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. Last year's tragedy was the confluence of a number of causes. It was poor planning. It was the absence of any planning, not just poor planning. It was the absence of any planning. It was at a point in the pandemic where people, for the first time, thought that they could go somewhere safely. And so, as we've seen, sometimes when you open up the floodgates, well, it all comes out. So more people came than they had ever anticipated, specifically because they felt that it was safe for the first time to do that. The previous year, I think, had been canceled, so it was a really horrific event. But I'm very glad to hear that there was some serious organization this year. There's no mitzvah to go to Meron. I just want to clarify that. Judaism, we do not have pilgrimages in the post-biblical times. We do not have a Hajj. We do not have the concept that it's a mitzvah to be in a certain place at a certain time. The more contemporary customs of the Breslover Hasidim being in Ukraine, being in Uman for Rosh Hashanah, that's neither here nor there. If people want to do it, they do it, but you haven't gained anything, and nobody's missing anything in their religious life if they haven't been to Uman for Rosh Hashanah. If you haven't been to Meron for Lag BaOmer, you're not missing anything. Really, there's no special mitzvah to be in a particular city at a particular time to do. Judaism follows us. We don't go to it. That being said, go to Israel, visit Jerusalem, visit the holy places. But Meron and Lag BaOmer, it's not a place I hope ever to be again in my life, in particular because of what happened last year. Fantastic. Lag BaOmer Sameach. Everyone be well. Shabbat Shalom. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for bringing the session on Lag BaOmer.